And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. The bladder is an organ that holds urine before it leaves the body. More than 90% of the cancer... Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. The bladder is an organ that holds urine before it leaves the body. More than 90% of bladder cancers start in the cells that make up the innermost lining of the bladder wall. On today's Open Connection, we'll open our archives to bring you this story from 1989.
Our study is really a major piece of research on the world literature because of the fact we could use the British Columbia Cancer Registry. Most studies of this kind can only look at causes of death, not cancer. And as you probably know, everybody who gets cancer either does not die of it or may die of some other cause. We do have cancer treatment is improving all the time, and there is even some problems with the way people record death certificates. So to have that information on cancer diagnosis really makes our study very important.
The Kitimat study also has a few special aspects.
We had two important factors in our study. One is the BC Cancer Registry, which allowed us to look at new cancer cases, not just deaths. If you notice on one of the slides, there were 16 cases of bladder cancer, but only 3 deaths. So if we'd been looking only at deaths, we might have missed that Bladder Cancer Association. And secondly was the work of the committee here, made up of the industrial hygienists and union health and safety representatives, who went back and historically assigned exposure to every job in the plant. That adds a lot of ability in our study to relate our mortality or cancer incidence with exposure.
As well as the relationship between tar fumes and bladder cancer, links to other types of cancer were established.
Our most important findings were that we confirmed a bladder cancer excess risk that was determined by Dr. Theriault in his Quebec study, that excess risk also exists in the Kitimat smelter for high-exposed individuals. We also found a higher rate of non-Hodgkin's lymphomas, which is a type of lymphatic cancer in individuals, pot room workers with long-term exposure. To lessen that a little bit, overall we found that the mortality and cancer incidence rates were in fact lower than the general population in the Kitimat cohort.
There has also been some question as to whether smelter workers run an increased risk of lung cancer. What did your study find about that?
Unfortunately, our study was a bit inconclusive on that. We found an association with exposure in that workers who are very high exposed for a long period of time had a higher risk of lung cancer than workers who are unexposed. But we couldn't be sure that wasn't due to chance. So we could neither confirm nor reject earlier findings of a lung cancer risk. Perhaps with a future analysis 5 years down the road, we will have more lung cancers and we'll be able to make a definitive statement on that.
Since the connection between cancer and tar fumes was first suspected more than 15 years ago, Alcan has spent $225 million on improvements at Kitimat Works to reduce exposure.
There have been probably 4 or 5 major areas that we tried to reduce worker exposure. The first was reducing the tar fume generation at source by changing the way in which we operate the anodes. And compared to prior to modernization, I think we reduced that tar fume generation by a factor of about 4. So there's less generation. Around the pot, we have what we call a gas collection system to try to capture all the gases that are emitted by the process. And we made improvements to that system, which again have given us significant benefits. We've improved the ventilation in the pot room buildings themselves so that we put more air through the pot rooms. And also the flow pattern changes so that there is more less escape of gases into the area of the pot room where people are actually working. Most of the work in the pot rooms is done in vehicles, specialized vehicles for various what we call pot servicing. Prior to the modernization program, all these vehicles were basically open cab. There was no protection, if you wish, from the worker, separation of the worker from the pot room environment. And what we have done is to take all of these vehicles and put cabs on them, create a closed environment, and an air filtration, air conditioning system to remove the gases from the airstream within the vehicle cab.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Aluminum inspires designers, architects, and engineers to innovate and challenge the status quo. The flexible metal has endless possibilities to create exciting products that change the way we live in innovative and sustainable ways. Let us return to the archives to discover innovation in the smelting process.
We have been developing some what we call second-generation pot room equipment that addresses not only the problem of tar fumes, but we're also trying to make the vehicles better to operate, more operator-friendly, cut down the noise exposure of the people, and in doing this, we've had to develop these vehicles. They're not vehicles that you can go to a manufacturer and say, give me Model X. We have to do the development here. Currently, we have finished the development of the ore truck, and we're starting to bring some of those into production this year. And we have a prototype unit for our diesel crust breaker that has been in commissioning for the last 2 or 3 months. So we are moving ahead on this, but again, they're not off-the-shelf models. We have to do the development work, and it takes time.
Some jobs that carried a high risk, such as stud pulling and trimming, have been mechanized. Given the limitations of the technology, can anything further be done?
I don't think that we're going to see any great improvements, the magnitude that have occurred already. We're talking the changes that have been made in the technology, in the protection through people wearing respiratory protection and so forth, of reducing people's exposure by a factor of about something in the order of 10. So that, those are very, very significant gains. I think we in this plant have taken what has been developed in the rest of the BS industry to try to reduce worker exposure, and we put this in place now. And there aren't things out there in the industry that we know about that we can go out and incorporate. So I think the rate of progress from now on will be a lot slower, and again, we won't get the kinds of gains that we've been able to achieve up until now.
The company is confident the improvements have reduced the risk to pot room workers.
The cohort study that was carried out here in Kitimat really is again looking at the past. It's looking at the exposures because it's a cumulative effect when we talk about, for example, BSM years of exposure. That's the kinds of exposures that existed in the early years in the plant. So in essence, we're looking back at the effects of those kind of exposures on health issues today. And we believe that the changes that have taken place in our equipment, in our ventilation improvements, etc., have put us where we have exposure levels which in many cases are about 1/10 of what they were in those early years. And at those levels, based on all the information we have, employees should be without that kind of risk. So in terms of saying what are we going to do about it, I would say that we have been doing something about it for the last 15 years.
The source of the coal tar volatiles are the briquettes of anode paste that must be added to the pots each day. and there are certain areas of the pot where most of the fumes are produced.
The anode consists of a mixture of calcined petroleum coke and coal tar pitch. And the main sources of emissions come from the surface of the anode here and down below at the gas skirt level.
The complex substances are found in many other parts of our environment, and their dangers are now being recognized.
Many of these coal tar pitch volatiles and their related compounds, which would be things like tobacco, smoke, and exhaust from cars, have been suspected for a long time to be carcinogens, and the evidence is now mounting, all right, that they have a certain carcinogenic potential.
Employees are checked regularly while on the job.
Well, we have a very extensive monitoring program, and at the present time the figure that we put the most credence in is what's called a personal sample. And we monitor the potmen or cell operators at least annually to determine their exposure to coal tar pitch. This involves them wearing a pump for a shift and a filter which collects the tar fumes, which is then analyzed in the lab and a result reported back to the workers.
There have been many improvements over the last 15 years put in place at the plant to try to reduce the exposure levels. How do you assess whether those steps are really working?
Well, when we were originally starting the modernization program, we were limited to just doing area samples because we couldn't analyze the small amounts. We were extensively testing every ventilation change made or stud pulling techniques to determine if the emissions from the pots were being reduced. We have augmented that since 1975 with these personal samples, and every time any modernization change has been made, we go into the building where the change is being made, analyze the results on the workers, and decide whether those steps are successful or not, or whether we have to make additional changes to get the result of low tar fume exposure for the worker.
And an enormous amount of testing has taken place.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. When you think about life in the long run, there are signs along the way that will direct you towards good health. The same is especially true when it comes to cancer screening. Let us return to the archives as Dr. Cooper shares the screening process.
Alcan workers who are exposed have a number of screening programs through our department. Of relevance to the study is the urine cytology that was mentioned. This is an early marker for bladder cancer, and it has been part of the department and part of the screening program since 1982. In addition, other tests include sputum cytology, which is designed to try to pick up early markers for lung cancer, and that has been part of the program since 1979. And with this element of the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I think it's important to know that one of the early markers for that is in the blood itself, specifically the white cell count. And we have been performing what we call complete blood counts, which looks at all elements of the blood on workers since 1982 as well. So all of these screening programs have been in place and continue to operate and have been doing so for some time.
What's the prognosis for a worker with bladder cancer if it's detected at its very early stages?
Well, I think it's well known, and I think it was mentioned in the presentation that bladder cancer is one of the cancers that, when picked up early, has a very good prognosis. It is regarded as one of the slower growing cancers, and when picked up early, it can be treated quite effectively.
And is it easy to detect?
Well, one of the things that one of the earliest detection devices is in the urine, and specifically blood in the urine. And that, again, is another test that is done routinely on everyone as well, is a simple urinalysis, which will pick up any blood.
As the study results have become more widely known, the Union Hall has fielded a lot of inquiries. Researchers have also confirmed more cases of cancer.
Well, most of the calls, at least that I've received, have been from either retirees or from widows. I guess they're more affected because of the old-timers in the plant.
What's next?
Well, I guess they are pursuing the bladder cancer claims with the Compensation Board. I've also been in contact with the Cancer Control Agency, and we found out since the study's released, or at least from the expiry date of the study, I think it said there were 14 or 16 bladder cases. We now know there are 23 up to the end of '87, and we expect more.
This wasn't a surprise to the union because the study results were based on information gathered by the Cancer Control Agency up till October of '85. Incidents of cases up to October of '87 are now available.
Well, they had a cutoff date of October of '85, and they have now since tracked the records to '87, and there were 7 additional cases in that from '85 to '87.
So this will make it even more urgent that the WCB consider the study and change their rules.
I would think so, and as I said, we suspect that there will be more. There's another 2 years up to the end of '89 that haven't been included as well, and I think we're going to find another 10, maybe 12 more cases at least.
It's expected that the study results will assist CASA in its attempts to have the Workers' Compensation Board accept more claims from victims.
Yes, there's no doubt about the connection, and in fact the board has already conceded as much. They have gone on record as acknowledging the connection. They have an internal memo advising their adjudicators about that. And since the study, we have wrote them and requested a meeting to discuss the new findings that the study has revealed. And we expect to be meeting with them by the end of this month.
The union is critical of Alcan for not giving more assistance to affected workers and retirees until their cases are ruled on by the WCB.
Where it's going to
the company rejects that.
Concerns.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
In 2005, the Workers' Compensation Board becomes known as WorkBC. The new name more accurately reflects the focus on prevention, customer service, and the return to work. In this final segment of Open Connection, we return to the archives with Works Manager Roger Bennett.
In terms of the cases which go through the WCB, I think as a general approach, we have for people who are sick or away from work a disability program. But if they are going to go through the WCB, then that becomes a separate issue. And until that's resolved, until the WCB identifies that there is a real valid claim, then the WCB will not compensate those individuals. If that claim is denied, then Alcan does pay the individuals for the time through the disability program that exists here.
So you feel that what you're doing right now, in other words, is adequate?
At this point in time, yes.
The union is trying to come up with a remedy.
There seems to be some problem in terms of the company in the initial stages acknowledging the connection between the exposure and the disease. And what we've asked Alcan since this study has been released has been for some more cooperation on their part in terms of supporting the claimants and trying to get some compensation for what they've got.
16 claims have been filed with workers' compensation, but only 8 of those have been accepted. Only 2 claimants have actually received any assistance. Hans Roloff is retired now. He worked for Alcan for 31 years. His job was right in the pot rooms for 13 and a half of those, and he was in and around them for the rest of the time. 6 months after retiring in May of '87, the first symptoms of bladder cancer showed up. Doctors gave Roloff 2 years to live, but after extensive treatment, he's been told he's one of the lucky ones. Back in 1956, when he first started at Alcan, conditions were a long way from what they are now.
One word, terrible. We had virtually no air conditioning. We had only fresh air fans, which were located on the roof, and then in the center of the pot rooms, floor fans. That was the only, well, and windows, you know, that was the only fresh air we had. When we made our regular runs, which means breaking the pots and adding ore and all that, alumina, you could hardly see the hand in front of your eyes. There was that polluted at that moment, especially in stud pulling, all that smoke and all that. So it wasn't very pleasant. And like I said, no air conditioning, you only had the dust mask on your face. And of course, people sweat a lot. And they clogged up and you couldn't breathe and you had to take them off and then put them again and took them off. And of course, there was lots of labor involved. You know, we had wheelbarrows, steel wheelbarrows to put all that, you know, shovel the ore in and all that we needed on the pots. There was physical labor in the lines that was hard. And the magnetism from the pots pulled the bucket one way or the other, so you had to hold on to that thing.
The pot rooms were smoky, and before mechanization, very physically demanding. But in the 50s, people had other things on their minds.
Well, at the time, you were more concerned bringing your family over, you know, and the money was good. I know people, they worked in Halifax, a couple of friends of mine, which I brought over later on, they worked there for 65 cents an hour. Here in Arkan, we had, the basic rate was at that time when I started, $1.67. That is quite a different. So when I told them, I arranged for them to come over here, and they started working right away. And both of them, they were long-time employees too.
And back then, there was more acceptance of poor working conditions.
Well, everybody knew that. We worked with the union people together. We were the union, actually. We all worked together, and we all complained to ourselves. We had restrooms where you could go in and rest for a while to get off that smoke. So, but out on the lanes, we were always under pressure. You know, that smoky and gassy condition that you had to breathe. Sometimes it got so bad you could hardly breathe. You know, you had to jump off the pot and run to the floor fence and lie down there and just inhale the fresh air, or run out to the windows just to get some fresh air into your lungs. Yeah, that was bad.
His claim was accepted by the WCB, and it admitted his cancer was caused by exposure to tar fumes.
I was even told by this one guy from the compensation board that I'm entitled for a pension. How small ever it is, it doesn't matter, but something to recognize all the anxiety you go through, you know.
However, the good news didn't last.
But then I got a letter telling me that according to all the doctors, where they send copies and Arkan, and you know, everyone gets a copy, that my disease has plateaued. You know, that is the exact word that he used, plateaued. In other words, I'm out of danger or something. So when I phoned, he says, you are not eligible for a pension anymore because of it. So I said, now how about all the anxiety, all the pain, all the inconveniences and all that I had to go through? My family, they were all up in uproar. I myself, I was devastated. I had to go every 3 months, I have to go in to the hospital, and that can go on for 10 years. First hearing is on for 10 years now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind to his heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.